For years, the social scientists have believed that socioeconomic level was what created an environment that resulted in this gap between expectation and achievement. What we want to do is rock your world and look at socioeconomic level itself as the barrier between expectation and achievement in higher education. We want to dispel the mythology, particularly the mythology that relates to minorities, where it is a deprived environment that causes the issue for higher education achievement. To that end, we want to look at a few hypotheses as they relate to this particular theory. We have to look at the socioeconomic level and determine if it has the impact on a gap between expectations and achievement. To that end, we're going to look at both gender as well as the impacts of race and ethnicity. And we want to examine that socioeconomic level gap between achievement and the original expectation. Before we go too far down the road, we need to talk a little bit about semantics. In 2010, Berezin used the term aspiration and expectation interchangeably. Likewise, in 2010, Beale and Crockett took it a step further. In their particular study, they identified aspiration as it related to vocational goal. And then they identified expectation as the educational level that was required to achieve the vocational aspiration. Likewise, it follows that educational achievement is the achievement of the original expectation. For the purposes of our discussion here, we'll use Beale and Crockett's definitions of aspiration, expectation, and achievement. The U.S. Department of Education, through its National Center for Education Statistics, provides a wealth of data on different studies as they relate to education. The beginning post-secondary student study is quite extensive and has been ongoing for many years. The study itself is a 6-year longitudinal study that tracks students from their original matriculation over a period of 6 years. The two follow-up points of the study are at the 3 and finally at the 6-year points. For this particular study, we're using the third cohort, which is data from the 2003 and 2004 academic years through 2009. This particular study involved 16,100 respondents, and it is quite thorough in regard to different variables that are available. Fortunately, it has the variables that we need for this particular examination. For the purpose of this particular examination, the following variables from the NCES BPS study were used. The first and dependent variable was adjusted gross income. In the case of dependent students, the adjusted gross income from the parents were used in order to have comparable data. Adjusted gross income was split into 5 different levels. The first level below $20,000, the second level between $20,000 and $40,000, the third between $40,000 and $60,000, the fourth between $60,000 and $80,000, and the final between $80,000 and $100,000. Data above $100,000 is considered to be unusable. 2 different runs of the study data were made. The first run was for gender as the independent variable, and the second for race or ethnicity. Within those 2 runs, we looked at 3 levels of expectation and achievement common to first-year students. The first is the certificate, the second, the associate's degree, and the third, the bachelor's degree. Now that we've got all the administrivia out of the way, let's go ahead and dig into the good stuff. Let's roll up our sleeves and really get into the results of gender. You'll notice that this data is first for the lowest income level. And very consistently you'll see there is a gap between expectation, which is the dark line, and achievement, which is the light line. What we really need to do, though, is look at the entire picture here, and there's something very interesting that shows up when we look at the female data. Notice the declination over the certificate, associate's degree, and bachelor's degree, and then look at the actual achievement levels. You can see that the angle of declination increases significantly for females. Let's look at the next income level. At the next income level, which is expectation in dark red and achievement in the lighter red, we start to see a reversal where at this particular income level, students have the ability to exceed expectations of the certificate. We have mixed results between the genders when we get to the associate's degree, with women exceeding expectation. But when we get to the third level, the gap is comparable between both males and females. The important thing, though, is to look at the big picture. The reversal of expectation and achievement levels is significant. When we move to the third income level, we see something of great significance in that everywhere expectation is overshadowed by achievement. This tells us something very important. At this particular point, we're not going to go above the third income level because we found this to be the telling break point of expectation and achievement. As we get into the results of race and ethnicity, please keep in mind what we've already seen in regard to gender. We want to see if what we saw in gender continues on into race and ethnicity. Again, the blue lines represent income levels below $20,000. On the far left, the results from the whites. We can see the gap at the certificate level. As we go to black, the gap at the certificate level continues. Hispanic is interesting. I'll give everybody a moment to see if you can figure out what happened and why are Hispanics at the certificate level exceeding their expectation. Did you think about culture? Once you understand the Hispanic culture, then we can see what happened and why that gap was closed. The Hispanic culture relies on extended family relationships that are very significant. And particularly for Hispanics, where no one in the family has achieved any sort of higher education, you'll find that extended family support is extensive. Things such as child care, income assistance, housing assistance. Effectively, the Hispanic culture can close that income gap because the culture of the extended family does it. And this is particularly true over a short time. Remember too that we're looking at this level of achievement over a 6-year period. So while there may be stop-outs, eventually over that 6 years, it's possible for Hispanics to exceed expectations at the certificate level. But once we get into the associate's degree, we see the trend in the picture of the gap continuing. And it continues again in the bachelor's degree. But there is something very significant that we'll see in a bit. Getting into the second income level, again we see reversal between expectation and achievement. In many of these cases, expectation and achievement are statistically identical. That applies for certificates for whites, the associate degree for whites, the associate degree for blacks, the bachelor's degree for blacks, the certificate for Hispanics, the associate's degree for Hispanics. Income is very important. What is interesting, though, is that at the certificate level, blacks far exceed expectations. At the associate's degree, again, we have mixed results. But at this particular level, expectation and achievement are statistically identical. The gap does, however, continue for all but blacks at the bachelor's degree. In this particular case, for blacks at the bachelor's degree, the data is statistically identical. But it is rather significant in that when we look at blacks across the board, once they progress to this particular income level, blacks tend to become very successful. Let's look at some more pictures. Start on the left side with the white level of declination for the first income group. You'll notice the level of declination as we go into blacks is identical. But when we take that same level of declination and apply it to Hispanics, we get a rather startling result over here in the bachelor's degree. Why is that? Why do Hispanics have such a high level of expectation in a bachelor's degree in the lower socioeconomic scale? We can relate that to the notion of upward social mobility. Upward social mobility can generate higher levels of expectation, although they don't necessarily follow through when we get into the actual achievement, even though Hispanic achievement levels are relatively high. Let's look at these angles again as we get into the second income level. Suddenly things change. For whites, they flatline. Essentially, expectation is level across certificate, associate's, and bachelor's degrees. But what we find for blacks, instead of declination, is inclination, with increasing levels of expectation. Hispanics also have that same inclination, but not at as great an angle. This is rather important. For the longest time, people thought that blacks and Hispanics were not achievers. Au contraire. This shows that as income level increases to the point where achievement is possible, blacks and Hispanics achieve at a significant level. And it's proof when we get into the third income level. Across everything, certificate, associate's degree, bachelor's degree, achievement exceeds expectations. At this point, we can also bring in Asians. I might explain that Asian data for the certificate and associate's degree were so small that they're considered unusable. So we can only use data for the bachelor's degree. But across all four major races and ethnicities, the story is the same. Achievement exceeds expectation. And it gets even more interesting when we look at the bachelor's degree across all races and ethnicities. Notice that achievement has very little variation at the bachelor's degree level. This certainly dispels the myth that Asians are overachievers. In fact, if we really want to look at the picture we see here, Hispanics are overachievers. Likewise, blacks are overachievers. Whites tend not to be significant overachievers when compared to the other races. And Asians are relatively comparable to whites in the second and third income levels. The mythology goes away. So where we're really interested in is that lowest income level, because once we get above 20,000, achievement of higher education becomes much greater, and by the time we hit the breakpoint of $40,000, essentially there is no statistical difference for the bachelor's degree across all races. This is significant. Now that everyone has the picture of the effects of income on expectations and achievement in higher education, let's see if we can make just a few general statements or observations in regard to low socioeconomic levels. First, we have to keep in mind that for blacks and Hispanics, this socioeconomic level becomes significant. 51% of the blacks who responded to this particular survey fell into the lowest socioeconomic level, below $20,000. For Hispanics, it was somewhat better, but still significant, with 41%. Asians and whites were respectively at 30 and 22%. So we can see that low socioeconomic level is more important when it comes to blacks and Hispanics and subsequent achievement in higher education. It also translates into lower expectations as we move into higher academic outcomes. In other words, expectations for the certificate are very much higher than expectations for the associate's and subsequently bachelor's degrees. We can see that there's a wide gap between expectation and achievement for all but Hispanics at the certificate level. And how this translates into higher education is we have a persistence risk that increases as we get into the lowest socioeconomic levels. What does this all mean to higher education institutions? Can we expect higher education to fill that gap? I doubt it. That would be an unreasonable expectation. But in terms of higher education, how can we do something that levels the playing field at the low socioeconomic levels? Keep in mind that at the lowest socioeconomic levels, pure subsistence has a priority over education. We cannot expect individuals to aspire to education when they have nothing to eat and no roof over their heads. So it's very reasonable to understand that subsistence is significant for students in the lowest socioeconomic levels. The result is stopouts and dropouts. But in higher education, what can we do? This is where student services can mitigate to a certain degree by supporting the low socioeconomic level student through referral to outside agencies who can indeed make subsistence less of a concern. We saw evidence of this with Hispanics, because Hispanic students at low socioeconomic levels had greater support that allowed them to close the gap. But for other students, they may not have family support. So our student services can be a very critical aspect in leveling the playing field for our students across the board. A very small increase in socioeconomic level can yield rather remarkable results. And that's the meaning for higher education. Let's do a real quick wrap up and put this little boy to bed. Socioeconomic levels, we know, are significant in their effects on expectations of academic outcomes. The higher the socioeconomic level, the more effective students are at achieving higher levels of academic outcome. We also know that there's a very significant gap between expectation and achievement, and that gap relates to student persistence. We're interested in student successes. An economic level itself does indeed have an effect on achievement of higher education.